Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me? I am Priscilla Wald. Thank you very much for coming. This is our first Language Arts and Media Program Symposium. I am the director of the Language Arts and Media Program, which is a grant that is spreading ideas about communication and rhetoric across campus, across fields, getting us all thinking about how we communicate, how we use language and non-verbal, non-visual cues, etc. This symposium is something that has been in the works since the summer. I had 3 people when I thought about doing it in mind that I thought would just be perfect, and to my good fortune, they all said yes. So I'm not going to bore you with anything further than saying thank you to the Language Arts and Media Program grant, as well as the Thompson Writing Program and the Trent Center, which are my co-sponsors for this event. So thank you very much, and let's go.
Good afternoon. My name is Monica Huerta. I am a postdoctoral associate in the Department of Women's Studies here at Duke University. I'm delighted to be introducing Martha Kenney today. Dr. Kenney is Assistant Professor of Women and Gender Studies at San Francisco State University. She earned her PhD at UC Santa Cruz in 2013 and was a postdoc here in the Department of Women's Studies at Duke. We're thrilled that she could be with us today. Located in the tradition of feminist science studies, her work looks at the politics and possibilities of biological storytelling. She studies how stories open up and foreclose biopolitical imaginaries, at once enlivening and informing our relationships with one another and our more than human worlds. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kenney. All right, can everybody hear me? Just to be clear about the mic. All right. I have a loud voice though, so I feel confident about this. I'm just trying to figure out what the best setup is for me here. All right, well, thank you. I'm really excited to be participating in this symposium since the relationship between science and story are at the heart of what I do as a teacher and as a theorist. As a feminist science studies scholar, I'm interested in how we can tell better stories about the natural world, where what counts as better is always contextual and at stake. In interdisciplinary settings and at parties, I'm often asked what I mean when I say I study science and storytelling, and what does feminism have to do with either of those things? So, to explain, I usually go straight into a description of Emily Martin's 1991 article, The Egg and the Sperm, which is an article that I also love to teach in my classes. In The Egg and the Sperm, Martin shows how accounts of human fertilization in popular culture, in biology textbooks, and even scientific journals, fertilization is told as a hero's journey, with the chosen sperm as hero. The sperm, against all odds, outcompetes his fellow sperms, survives an arduous journey through the reproductive system, female reproductive system, and is rewarded by being the first to penetrate the egg. This is the story of an active, competitive sperm and a passive egg, who is the prize for the hero rather than an actor in her own right. The problem with this story, Martin argues, is not only that gender stereotypes are projected onto gametes, making those stereotypes seem natural, it's also that the fairy tale story has shaped how research on human fertilization is done. For example, guided by the story of the active sperm and the passive egg, it was difficult for researchers to see how the egg participated in fertilization, to actually see it. It wasn't until the late 1980s that researchers realized that the sperm don't actually have the forward thrust to mechanically penetrate that egg. Rather, their momentum is mostly sideways, which allows sperm to move away from the tissues that they come into contact with. It is only when the egg and the sperm are stuck together that the sperm can chemically pass through the zona. However, when this was discovered, the stereotypes were not ejected, only amended. Now the egg is cast as an overly aggressive femme fatale who binds the sperm to her, trapping him there until he's pulled in. What I like about Emily Martin's article is not just the classic feminist message about how stereotypes can creep into our descriptions of nature, but also the broader point that story is part of the fabric of scientific research. Narratives enable and constrain what it's possible to see and what it's possible to know. Martin and other feminist science studies scholars illustrate how stories do not just communicate scientific evidence, but are one of the important meaning-making practices in the natural sciences. That is, they do epistemological, semiotic, and political work. To explore this idea further today, I want to turn to the recent work of evolutionary biologist Joan Roughgarden, who is professor emerita at Stanford University. I go to Roughgarden here because her method is simultaneously narrative and empirical. She is concerned with both story and evidence. The title of her 2009 book, The Genial Gene, nicely illustrates her attention to language as part of the practice of doing evolutionary biology. The title is a critique of the organizing metaphor in Richard Dawkins' 1976, The Selfish Gene, where he presents a view of evolution where genes function to outcompete one another through, quote, savage competition, ruthless exploitation, and deceit. While Roughgarden agrees with Dawkins' central argument that individual selection is more significant to evolutionary theory than group selection, she argues that Dawkins' metaphor of the selfish gene has limited much of the evolutionary research that has come after it, crowding out other possible explanations for the social behavior of animals and the function of genes. Roughgarden writes that the dominance of Dawkins' tropes give us not only a narrow set of evolutionary explanations, but, quote, a philosophy of universal selfishness, conflict, and lack of empathy, as though revealed through evolutionary biology. Like Emily Martin, Roughgarden is concerned with both the political and scientific consequences of the dominant story. It simultaneously offers a poor account of nature, and it naturalizes a kind of Ayn Rand individualist worldview. The title of her book, however, is somewhat misleading, in that the genial gene is not predominantly a discussion of genetics in evolutionary biology, but rather a specific critique of sexual selection, a mechanism of evolutionary change proposed by Darwin that explains how certain traits are selected for not via ecological adaptation, but reproductive success. Roughgarden is critical of how individualism and selfishness underlie most sexual selection narratives, and also believes them to be poorly supported by current data. To counter these dominant evolutionary stories, Roughgarden explores instead how cooperation and teamwork can be understood as mechanisms of evolutionary change. Boldly and controversially, Roughgarden argues that sexual selection, which is a widely accepted evolutionary theory, should be replaced altogether, arguing instead for a theory of social selection that pays attention to the evolutionary consequences of the entire social structure in which offspring are reared, not just mating behavior and reproduction. I'll return to the controversy surrounding this argument later. So what is sexual selection? According to Darwin's theory of sexual selection, which is laid out in The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, within a given species, certain physical traits, such as the bright feathers of a peacock's tail, provide males with a reproductive advantage. The females choose to mate with the males who have the best example of that trait, and therefore, over time, it is selected for within the population at large, despite causing, for example, an increased risk of predation. As Darwin argues, the peahen's, quote, continued preference for the most beautiful males rendered the peacock the most splendid of living birds. In many neo-Darwinian accounts, neo-Darwinian is Darwin plus genetics, male ornaments, like the peacock's tail, are considered indicators of genetic quality, the genetic quality of males. The elaborateness of the peacock's tail can be seen as advertising his good genes to potential mates. The stock characters in these sexual selection stories are coy females, the coy female who is choosy and interested in mate quality so she can endow her offspring with good genes, and the passionate male who wants to maximize his chances to mate. Coy female, passionate male. The plot of these evolutionary stories is about the reproductive success of individuals measured by the quantity of offspring produced, and sexual conflict, which means that males and females have different goals. The plot is driven by male competition for access to females and by females who are out to choose the best mate. Joan Roughgarden believes that the universal male and female templates, the passionate male and coy female, offered by sexual selection are, quote, inadequate to address the diversity of bodies, behaviors, and life histories that actually exist. Much of her writing addresses the wealth of data in the primary peer-reviewed literature on the thousands of species who do not conform to the sexual selection narrative templates, such as the female alpine accenter who solicits males for mating. However, it is easy to cast these species, despite their numbers, as outliers that do not challenge sexual selection itself, but can be accounted for with some small amendments. So, for example, the accenters are considered a sex role reversed species, which is, and they're cast as an exception that seemingly proves the rule, right? For this reason, Roughgarden does not speak only of outliers. In order to dismantle the central story, she returns to the species that seem to conform most with the template. Roughgarden goes back to the most potent fables of sexual selection and retells them, trying on different hypotheses. In the first chapter of The Genial Gene, she leads us right back to the peacock, the bird whose picture is used in every textbook, in every PowerPoint that discusses sexual selection. Roughgarden offers an alternative account of peacock evolution proposed by a team of Japanese researchers. The article is Takahashi et al. 2008. So Takahashi et al. 2008 found in a 6-year study of 105 free-ranging Indian peafowls that peahens do not prefer peacocks with more elaborate trains. Takahashi et al. Provide an alternative evolutionary explanation for their research that directly contradicts the Darwinian account in which both the peacock and peahen were originally drab and the peacock became bright through sexual selection. In this new story, they propose the reverse. Both the male and the female were originally bright colored. However, since females were more vulnerable to predation while incubating their eggs, their color became more cryptic over time due to natural selection, while the males remained bright. This new explanation is supported by evidence from their study, which found that despite their cryptic coloring, females were twice as vulnerable to predation than males. They also cited other studies that show the bright plumage in galliform birds, like the peacock, the bright plumage is inhibited by estrogen, suggesting that the cryptic coloring of the female is a more recently derived trait. When sexual selection could not account for the data collected in this study, there was a narrative opening. What can account for this phenomenon if not sexual selection? Is there evidence to support a different story? The findings from Takahashi et al. Raise a larger evolutionary question. Why do peacocks continue to have brightly colored plumage when brightly colored plumage is more likely to catch the attention of predators? Roughgarden suggests an alternative hypothesis. Rather than communicating information about a male's good genes to potential mates, Roughgarden suggests that brightly colored tails act instead as, quote, admissions tickets to power-holding cliques that control the resources for successful rearing of offspring. In Roughgarden's account, bright tails are part of a wider set of social inclusionary traits that not only consist of physiological traits that serve social functions, but also social behaviors like grooming that promote teamwork among individuals. Throughout the genial gene, Roughgarden emphasizes the need to work against confirmation bias in evolutionary biology and to test multiple hypotheses. She writes, quote, "I can't overemphasize enough that evolutionary theories, like theories in any other area of biology, such as molecular biology, genetics, and physiology, are destined for testing," unquote. This not only includes sexual selection, but also her own theory of social selection, which she presents not as a complete or confirmed theory, but as a set of hypotheses destined for testing. At the end of the genial gene, she writes, quote, "Time will tell whether social selection is indeed correct or whether some substantial modification or third approach is needed." The genial gene is an invitation for more hypotheses about evolution that can account for the sheer diversity of social behaviors and physical traits in the natural world. "The welcoming door is open," she concludes. "Come on in." Described in this way, Roughgarden's argument doesn't seem very controversial. Indeed, it is firmly rooted in a conventional understanding of scientific rigor, right? Reviewing the data that exist in the literature, testing more hypotheses, avoiding confirmation bias, publishing more negative results, considering alternative explanations when the data do not support the dominant theory. However, when she published this argument in the journal Science in 2006, 40 evolutionary biologists sent in 10 letters that viciously criticized her claims and methods, writing that her work represents an attack on Darwin, that she fails to understand the scientific method, and threatens to set evolutionary biology back some 30 years, as if one person could do that. After this initial attack, Roughgarden's views have been actively marginalized in the peer review literature, often being called idiosyncratic, unusual, unorthodox, and representing only a fringe viewpoint. Given her reasonable, welcoming, and scientifically sound rhetoric, why are all these evolutionary biologists responding to her work as if to a threat? One straightforward answer is because Roughgarden's 2004 book, Evolution's Rainbow, is explicitly political. She investigates many species that differ from the male and female templates of sexual selection, the many species that engage in same-sex sexual behavior, and the many species that raise their young in social structures that have little to do with heteronormative monogamy. In this earlier book, Roughgarden speaks openly about her own identity as a transgender woman and about the need for evolutionary biologists to pay attention to the wealth of primary data on diversity for both political and scientific reasons. Although The Genial Gene is a very different book than Evolution's Rainbow, that speaks specifically to the theory of sexual selection and Roughgarden's proposed alternative social selection, her colleagues' distaste for her arguments are clearly colored by their reaction to Evolution's Rainbow. Reactions often accompanied by overt transphobia and their assertion that science is no place for politics. As if there's no personal, political, or cultural investments in the status quo, only from those who challenge it. This view is summed up nicely, or not so nicely, by mathematical biologist Troy Day, who explained that many people believe Roughgarden's work to be, quote, shoddy science and poor scholarship, all motivated by a personal agenda. While this backlash could easily be characterized in terms of a discomfort with LGBT politics and people in general, and in science specifically, this only captures, I think, part of why Roughgarden's work is threatening. I'd like to suggest that her method, which I said earlier is simultaneously narrative and empirical, is the real scandal here. In The Genial Gene, Roughgarden works inside the narrative tissue of evolutionary biology, following her hunch that thinly disguised stereotypes cannot possibly account for the behaviors of the millions of species on planet Earth. However, Because the arguments in the books are aimed at convincing scientifically minded audiences the validity of her claims, Roughgarden downplays the importance of story to her method. She states often, and when I say often, I mean like 12 times in this book, that the issue is not whether we find sexual selection narratives to be appealing or repugnant, but whether they are true. However, I believe that Roughgarden is actually doing a disservice to the important role that repugnance, or rather disgust, plays in her own approach. And this is where my interpretation is going to depart from Roughgarden's. Take, for example, this passage where she illustrates how the sexual selection literature pathologizes any departure from the universal male and female templates of the coy female and the passionate male. She writes, "In the primary peer-reviewed literature, males are described as being cuckolded, females as faithful or promiscuous, offspring as legitimate or illegitimate, males who do not hold territory as floaters or sneakers, code for sneaky fuckers, all of whom are sexual parasites, small males as gigolos, feminine males as female mimics, or even as transvestite serpents, or she-males, a pornographic reference, and so forth." Here, Roughgarden's personal and political distaste for language that polices gender, sexuality, and kinship is the motivation for narrative speculation. Is there another story? Can the evidence support another story? The science Roughgarden does in her lab, where she uses game theory to model cooperation in the social structures of language, would not be possible, I'm going to argue, without this kind of disgust, right? Is there a way to affirm rather than deny the importance of narrative affinity, narrative allergy in Roughgarden's work, without also losing the scientific rigor or the strength of her knowledge claims? To embrace storytelling as scientific practice without fear of relativism. To grapple with the political questions of biological storytelling rather than pretending that science is free from politics. These are the questions that remain for me at the end of the genial gene. I'm left wanting a different way of imagining the relation between story and evidence, where story isn't ultimately subordinate to data. The question that grabs me is not Roughgarden's question, is the story true, but something more speculative, a question that opens up rather than forecloses narrative possibilities in evolutionary biology. The question I want to ask instead is, how many plots can the data hold? With this question, with this refrain, I'm working with the different meanings of the word plot. Plotting a graph is the practice of drawing relations between data points, Data points are not meaningful on their own, but must be brought into relation with one another to become evidence. There are different ways of connecting the dots, as it were. Different ways of connecting the dots, some better than others. What is included, what is excluded, what becomes signal, what becomes noise is decided through a process of interpretation. How many plots can the data hold uses graphing as a visual metaphor. As a visual metaphor for thinking about the relationship between narrative and evidence. Plotting, of course, is also a practice of storytelling, of identifying meaningful actors and actions, of ordering them in time, of discerning cause and effect. The problem with the egg and the sperm story is that the sperm is the active protagonist, swimming, racing, penetrating, fertilizing, where the egg is the passive prize and the woman's body is the background at best, and at worst is the obstacle to be overcome, right? But there isn't only one way to tell the story. What happens if we change the protagonist to the egg, or even to the fallopian tubes? And I actually have an example of this, which we can talk about later. What stories are possible? What research questions does it become possible to ask? In the case of human fertilization, how many plots can the data hold can open up new pathways of narration, relation, and investigation. To plot a graph and to plot a story are both meaning-making activities. How many plots can the data hold asks us to multiply our meaning-making strategies, to try on different stories, categories, metaphors, actors, to account for, to bring into relation, to make sense of the data, and to make sense of our world. The answer to how many plots can the data hold might be more than one, but it's not a relativist question. The answer is not infinite. How many plots can the data hold is my attempt to pose a question at the intersection of science, of story, and evidence. A question that is simultaneously speculative and pragmatic. A question that feels actionable. Like often in my field, feminist science studies, we can be very good at critique. So we can see these stereotypes in the egg and the sperm or in sexual selection and say there's a problem here. But that doesn't lead us to doing anything particularly. So I'm trying to find small things that seem actionable where there's a doing. So how many plots can the data hold I'm imagining as something that might be actionable. I came up with this formulation to find another way to approach scientific work like the genial gene, where we would not have to separate the empirical/scientific from the narrative/political. What is exciting to me in the genial gene isn't that Roughgarden's theories of sexual selection are necessarily true, though they might be, nor that her stories align with my politics, which they also might, but that it unsettles what we thought we knew about evolution. That it takes us inside the most familiar biological stories and insists that another story is possible. The peacock's tail might not be the ultimate example of a world in which males compete for access to females. When Takahashi et al. Found that their data would not hold the sexual selection narrative, they looked to find evidence to furnish another story. They looked toward the role of estrogen in plumage colors. Roughgarden looked at the social structure in which peafowl rear their offspring. Going back into the peer-reviewed literature, into studies that have already been completed, and asking how many plots can the data hold, offers different empirical and narrative strategies for the practice of doing evolutionary biology. This is also, of course, a political question. It's a political question not because it asks evolutionary biology to become politically correct, that is, to make evolutionary theories conform to our worldview, but rather because it activates different possibilities for knowing and relating to the life around us. Roughgarden's theory of social selection, for example, asks us to question the centrality of mating in evolutionary accounts of animal behavior, and to look at other reproductive social behaviors, like animal friendships, that strengthen the social infrastructure in which offspring are reared. Roughgarden's hypothesis is radical not only because it asks us to consider animals as capable of friendship, rather than blind survival and reproduction, but it also asks us to consider friendship as something that could make a real species-shaping difference, creating new avenues for evolutionary research, and also an occasion for us to reconsider the value of friendship in our own lives. Asking how many plots can the data hold invites this kind of empirical narrative speculative and empirical inquiry, where evolutionary biology could be called upon to contest rather than confirm an established order. Not by dropping the science and picking up the politics, but by working with story and data simultaneously, with equal skill and seriousness. But to approach this question with equal skill and with skill and seriousness, I believe we can't rely on familiar knowledge-making practices. We would need to devise new connections between the sciences on the one hand and the arts and humanities, new ways of working together, new kinds of accuracy. Accuracy is a term we tend to associate with the methods of the natural sciences. With statistical practices such as excluding outliers from data sets and computing margins of error. However, in the arts and humanities, we also experience our activities as a process of working with and towards accuracy. Take, for example, this excerpt from an interview with writer, poet, and classicist Anne Carson, on the topic of writing. We're talking about the struggle to drag a thought over from the mush of the unconscious into some kind of grammar, syntax, human sense. Every attempt means starting over with language, starting over with accuracy. I mean, every thought starts over, so every expression of thought has to do the same. Every accuracy has to be invented. Carson's accuracy isn't a scientific accuracy about bringing a measurement as close as possible to the correct value, but a linguistic or poetic accuracy. It pertains to the difficulty of capturing or maybe rendering something with language. It needs to begin again every time, the need to begin again every time with language as if from scratch. For example, in Carson's first book, Eros the Bittersweet, Carson's first book, Eros the Bittersweet, is a meditation on how the ancient Greeks understood Eros. The accuracy that Carson invented as she wrote this book is translational and expressive, capturing with precision a certain sensibility from the Greek, a certain flavor, and rendering it evocatively again in English. Working with a fragment from Sappho, Carson writes, "Sweet bitter Eros is what hits the raw film of the lover's mind." I love this quote. Here you can see Carson renders the adjective in the unfamiliar order of the Greek, sweet bitter rather than bittersweet, but uses the anachronistic metaphor of film to make vivid the workings of Eros in the mind of the 20th and 21st century reader. Accuracy here isn't about historical faithfulness, but poetic faithfulness, which is affected in this quote through this tension between the familiar and the unfamiliar. Carson's description of the difficulty of dragging a thought into language resonates with my own writing practice, where I struggle with the ways that language itself constrains and enables what is possible to express. There's also the rare pleasure of being able to render something with words that was not possible to say before, to feel the accuracy of the phrasing. This is the reason why humanities scholars often read written talks, like I'm doing now, often at the expense of things like eye contact. But this is why I think humanities scholars tend to read, rather than to speak off the cuff, because. Hold on. I need to find my place. Watch this happen. Since words matter to the composition of thought, they are substance, not vehicle. It feels important to have them stable right here on the page. In the natural sciences, speaking off the cuff from PowerPoint is more common because words are not the locus of the accuracy. It's the data, which is there in the PowerPoint, stable in the chart or graph. These are different practices of doing accuracy with different disciplinary conventions. This is why our empirical and narrative question, how many plots can the data hold, is fundamentally an interdisciplinary question. It requires people trained in different kinds of disciplinary accuracy, consummate storytellers and consummate observers, experimenters, statisticians, working together on a practice where neither the data nor the story is foundational, but where they must be handled together. How many plots can the data hold is an invitation, not just to mix pre-existing disciplinary practices, but to invent new forms of accuracy that might be unfamiliar or awkward, but could be epistemologically, narratively, and politically generative. Of course, this isn't the only way to imagine the relation between story and evidence. Data does not always precede story. As Emily Martin shows in The Egg and the Sperm, stories guide how we pay attention to the world and what seems significant. Or sometimes, the work to craft just one good story, or even a partial story, from the chaos of the data is the real epistemological and political challenge. But I just wanted to offer how many plots can the data hold today as a seed, a meme, a spark, call for fewer just so stories, more what if stories, to use the speculative to crack open the ordinary, to embrace rather than disavow the storytelling practices of scientists like Joan Roughgarden, to fashion possible attachment sites for cross-disciplinary collaboration, and to invent new forms of accuracy. And since stories run through our knowledge practices, whether we like it or not, I feel like it's worth a try. Thanks. Yeah, I'll take a couple slides.
And I'm going to set up the other.
Can I I have a couple slides to show in case people ask me things I have pictures about.
Okay. So we'll take a couple of questions. We'll do most of the discussion at the end, but we will take a few questions now. If anyone has any. Thank you. Well, I'll ask you to say, can you elaborate a little more? I was really interested in what you said about the different disciplines.
Yeah.
And different ideas of accuracy.
Yeah.
Can you extend that a little to evidence? Because one of the things we're talking about here is story as evidence and the way that different disciplines construct evidence differently. So on the one hand, I was particularly interested in you're talking about different forms of presentation.
Yeah.
Because I remember the first time I ever presented at a medical audience, I read a paper and everyone walked out. So,
Yeah.
it really, really is. It's like, what? That's so rude. Whereas for us, I've never thought about it. You're absolutely right. The word is critical,
The
right?
accuracy is
So,
in here.
and
Yeah.
you communicate differently in those different ways. So that's presentation, but it's based on a different understanding of evidence. So I'm wondering if you could say a little about that.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned it because I actually added the accuracy part to my talk because I had been thinking about a conversation, Priscilla, that you and I have been having about this question of evidence in different disciplines, and I was questioning my resistance to your formulation that different disciplines have different way of crafting evidence because I feel in my own work that maybe evidence isn't the thing that I'm trying to do, and that maybe the kind of practice of theorizing that I'm doing has more in common actually with the arts and poetry, which is about kind of crafting words, phrases, and language that sort of reworld us, that orient us in the world differently, and pointing, and that's the kind of what words do rather than what words point at. To me, seems important in my own practice, though I have many colleagues in the humanities who do. They go into archives, they look for historical evidence, they look for patterns of words that have been, in 18th century manuscripts on farming. That's evidence. So I was trying to think, if not evidence, then what? And accuracy, this Anne Carson quote about this dragging the mush of the unconscious into a grammar is why writing is very painful and occasionally very joyous for me. I was thinking about this with my students who also were struggling to use kind of precise language. I want to talk about the magic of the right word. And I thought maybe that could be productively put into conversation with the practices in the natural sciences in ways that resonate more with my practice or Anne Carson's practice of working, rather than maybe some of the more empirical humanities. So I offer accuracy next to evidence as something that some disciplines have and do in different ways.
Great. Any other questions? We will have questions and discussion at the end, so. Yeah, Rob.
Thank you. Two related questions. First, in all the attacks on her, did you break it down by which scientific discipline? Or did you just throw all the scientists together?
The attacks were almost entirely within evolutionary biology and by the people who work with sexual selection, even more in particular.
So you did exclude then a number of scientists who would still be interested in the question.
Yeah, though very few scientists wrote positive reviews that were in publications that would circulate widely. Like there wasn't a review in something like PLOS Biology or something like that.
I meant like psychology.
Yeah, like I read all of the secondary literature on the genial gene, and from the natural sciences, there was there were very few outspoken people for the genial gene.
Okay.
So lots of people might have enjoyed it privately.
The second question I have, you talk about word and evidence, and you make a contrast between the scientific and the literary, but you've missed the whole, what is both in, say, law
Yeah.
or even in medical practice.
Well, that's something that I would love to hear from people. Like, what counts as accuracy in law? What counts as accuracy in medicine? And how does putting those practices together around a kind of pragmatic question kind of torque them and rework them? So for me, it's something that I would like to see in action and hear from people what their disciplines obligate them to in terms of accuracy. And like part of the reason I talked about speaking a talk rather than reading a talk is often we have these interdisciplinary meetings where it's like, we're going to get people from across the disciplines. It's going to be great. We're going to do all this great thinking together. And really, it's really hard to think together in any kind of way interdisciplinary. I was one of the founding members of the Science and Justice Research Center at UC Santa Cruz that was designed as an interdisciplinary space for dealing with questions of science and social and environmental justice. And we found that just getting on the same page about one thing was really, really challenging. Like, for example, there was some terrible violent attacks against researchers on our campus who were using animals in their, like, doing research with animals, laboratory animals. And so we wanted to put out a statement that said the Science and Justice Research Center is against violence and that we're for talking about these kinds of issues. And it took us 6 months to get this statement out, despite the fact that everyone was against these attacks. And some of those things are if folks from the sciences come in and see somebody in the humanities like this, and it's like, this is boring. But instead we need to teach each other why we do these kinds of things. So to have a legal scholar in the room and to have a poet and to figure out how they could ask a question that would be at the join of their practices. That's the kind of thing that would be exciting to me and would be mostly frustrating to those people for a while. And then cool things happen. You know, that's what I...
So, I'll wait for the microphone.
Let me be the bad guy.
Okay.
I would introduce the same question, two different. Is it on? I would introduce the same question several different ways. Introduce the same question several different ways. Instead of dialogue, would you welcome trialogue?
Sure.
Okay. The other way is with the sperm and the egg. How about the word environment?
Environment for what?
You start, you bid. That's the question.
The word...
That's the question.
I don't know the answer to that question.
This wonderful reasoning and research into the verbal side of things, I think, demands re-examination of everything in terms of what if you had considered environment.
And what would count for you as environment in this context?
Well, the first thing would be the woman's womb.
Yeah.
All this is going on inside of women. Period.
Yeah, so that actually is a nice opening for, I wanted to say, like, what happens if we change the actors in the egg and the sperm story. So I was watching this documentary, in loose quotation marks, that was made in the UK. It's called The Great Sperm Race. And what they did is they took the fertilization story and they scale it up to human size. So you had a bunch of people wearing white outfits, and they're like running through these kind of like Lord of the Rings springs kind of environments and taking on obstacles and stuff, and those are supposed to, oh, it's the lymphocytes, and here they are. So we have the hero's journey, right? It's actually super fun to teach in my class because it's a goofy rather than kind of vicious example of this story. That's why I like it. But what's really interesting, so they're all competing. There's all this arduous. The woman's reproductive system is the background. It's this terrible environment for sperm. They're like, when they go into the cervix, it's like literally sperm hell. Anyway, so we're going through all of this, and then at the end, just as they're about to reach the egg in this story, 1 second. Oh wait, there we go. So these are all the sperm, and they're like relaxing out in this boat that's like full of delicious food. And it was like, this is a different narrative element. Like, why are they in this boat? And one of the researchers who was one of the talking heads of the interview, what she had done was a self-experiment where she was going to have a tubal ligation. And she wanted to know how long sperm could survive in the fallopian tubes. So she had sex with her husband, and then got a little cross-section of the fallopian tube as they were performing the operation, and what they learned was that sperm can survive in the fallopian tube for quite some time, for a matter of days. And so it was this kind of self-experiment on her own body and this kind of agency that changed up the story. We have a race, and then a whole bunch of lounging around, and then the fertilization. And I thought that was a really, it was jarring narratively, and it made you curious about what kind of practice caused this change in narrative, and we found out in the film. So that's to make instead of to make the woman's body the background, to talk about the fallopian tubes as a place where there's nourishment for sperms, or I'm trying to say it so that the sperms don't have the agency there. That's why the writing, because you want to say everything right. But that's an example for me of what happens when you pay attention to environment.
That's great. You just brought in the engineering school and the medical school.
Very well.
Thank you.